Good morning, good morning. I'm happy to see so many of you joining online this morning. We're going to give a minute or two for everybody to hop onto the Zoom call and also to tune into LinkedIn Live and YouTube, where we are streaming live. I'm Natalia Rachel, and today I'm tuning in for the first online webinar of 2024 from my new home in Sydney, which feels really, really beautiful. All of the previous sort of free webinars I've done were in my previous home in Singapore. And just before Christmas, I've sort of shifted my base back here to my new home, my homeland by the ocean. So it's 9 a.m. in Sydney. It's 6 a.m. very early in Singapore, where I'll be traveling back to next week to teach. And it is 10 p.m. in the UK, 5 p.m. in New York, and 2 p.m. on Sunday in LA. So I'd love to begin by learning where you're all tuning in from. So if you're able to pop into the chat, whether via Zoom or on LinkedIn or YouTube, where you're calling in from, it's really nice to sort of energetically connect with so many of you all over the world. So please don't be shy. Hi in Seattle, Portugal. Hello. So nice to connect in. Toronto, hello. Wow, so wonderful. Please keep it coming. I think it's so nice, not only for me, but for all of us to feel that sense of collective and connectedness. Berlin, North Carolina, wonderful. Today's topic is all about collective trauma and collective healing. So, how nice to be tuning in to begin with the collective of us today that are tuning in for this session. So, we'll give it another minute or so while people come on, but let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to be exploring today. So, the topic of today's webinar is collective trauma and intercultural healing. And we'll begin, as I usually do in these live sessions, with a couple of definitions because it's really important that we share a point of departure for our exploration together. We're also going to be looking at the cultures that we're living in today and the concept of trauma decontextualized. So we'll be talking about cultures of survival, exclusion, and disconnection. And just as we'll be talking about cultures of trauma, we're also going to be talking about cultures of healing and what it means for us to really move the needle and shift away from survival and adaptation and towards evolution and healing, which I think is something we all want, but collectively have been struggling with. And I really hope that this conversation inspires thought and action. We'll also be taking a pause to orient to this moment in humanity where we all meet and what's going on for us and perhaps what might be stopping us. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit more about my work and what to expect in 2024. I feel like here in Sydney already the last 2 months, a lot is shifting for me. And of course, as my world continues to turn, so does my voice and my work. So I'm excited about what's ahead. As always, in these sessions, the value and the texture and the nuance comes from your engagement. I don't have all of the answers. I'm just a curious human that wants to inquire and discuss with you. So I really welcome you to put your questions, reflections, thoughts, counterpoints into the chat. And the lovely Marianne, who's online, is going to be collating them across all the different platforms. And there'll be a couple of points within the session where I pause to really engage with you. So please don't be shy. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say as well. Okay, let's get started. So before we talk about collective trauma, let's orient to a definition of trauma that we can begin from. My definition of trauma is when a past experience of threat or exclusion that's over is living and breathing in us now. And it can affect us mentally, emotionally, physiologically, and relationally, socially, dynamically. It's largely unconscious and it's nonverbal. It's felt. It shows up as sensations, emotions, and relating patterns. And it travels through relationships, families, communities, cultures, and becomes our systems. Now, just as trauma travels through relationships, so does healing. And this is so important for us to understand that the way we show up and relate in the world has the potential to perpetuate the same cycles of trauma or to shift us to create new cycles of healing. And this is everything that my work is about. So now that we have a shared definition of trauma, let's talk about a definition for collective trauma. Collective trauma happens when together we live through a shared experience that causes survival adaptations. We survive together. We become altered together, perhaps in really similar ways, but also perhaps in very unique, nuanced, or incongruent ways. But it's due to the same root cause. It's also important that we take a moment to consider, well, what is the collective? Because the collective can be applied to all of humanity, but it can also be applied to slices or segments of humanity. And so when we're exploring this topic or taking it into our own world and our own work, it's important to get clear and define, well, which collective are we talking about? So the collective may be cultural, it may be geographical, it may be generational. And I'm quite interested in the generational piece. Those of you who attended the last live session about 3 months ago, last quarter, it was all about intergenerational trauma. But there are so many ways to slice up idea of the collective, and I leave it to you in your own processing and in your own inquiry to define the collective that you're exploring for yourselves. The most important thing to remember is that collective trauma is shared. We're not alone in it. And so often, when we are holding unresolved trauma, we feel very disconnected and we feel very alone with it. And that aloneness can be part of what immobilizes us and stops us from healing. And so, honoring the connectiveness, the collective nature of our trauma, just in itself, just so simply, can be a really important just little shift or reframe that allows us to begin to feel less alone and move towards a shared sense of healing. Just as we experience collective trauma, we can also experience collective healing. And that's what we are all here for today. Before we get a little bit more into the meat of the subject, let's take a moment to honor how important the collective is for our healing with a poem. Now, this poem's called The Sacred Cauldron. And if it feels appropriate and safe for you, I invite you to tune in by closing your eyes or adopting a downward gaze, or at the very least, turning off any of your communication apps that may be taking your attention so there are no pings or messages coming through, so you can really drop in a little deeper. And you can allow these words to touch you in whatever way they will, while we then slide in a little deeper to the session. Healing happens between us in the reflections of goodness, the gentle holding of darkness, the shared collective breath, a unified heartbeat, the ownership of privilege and power, shared capacity, respect and reverence, a sacred cauldron where we place our pain, let it simmer and rise like smoke into the sky, ashes becoming restorative compost for our aching earth, the seed of regeneration, a living, loving prayer of transformation, one conscious interaction at a time. Slowly, slowly, we heal with each other. We heal for each other. Let it begin here. So take a couple of breaths and let those words settle into you, move through you, or slide off you, whatever's really natural. And you can, if you have had your eyes closed, you can gently open them and tune back in to this time together, to this conversation, to this shared moment of intention and inquiry. Let's take a look at our modern world and some of the cultural norms and trends that really could be considered trauma decontextualized. So, this little bit of our time together, we're going to be looking at cultures of survival, exclusion, and disconnection. And I've got a lot to share with you. So please, if there are questions or reflections coming up as I speak, do put them into the chat. And in a little while, I'll pause to engage with everything that you've got to say so we can have a real conversation. When we're living in survival, it breeds disconnection, hustle, and competition. And it's important that we understand how those trauma adaptations manifest and decontextualize to create who we are individually and the way that we create cultures collectively. So, when we are living through survival, there's often not enough. There's not enough for us to survive. There's not enough resources to feel safe and alive and vital. And when we carry this sense of deprivation through us beyond the trauma, it actually becomes self abandonment. It becomes neglect. It becomes not giving ourselves what we need. And it becomes really normal to live in these ways that are self abandoning and neglectful. And I believe self abandonment is the disease of our generation. We see it in a lot of little micro ways. If we think about dieting and the obsession with having the perfect body, or similarly using sport or exercise to be less, to be smaller, to get rid of. We may also look at it as showing up through the hoarding of objects or money or wealth. We may also see deprivation as the inability to access joy and abundance and play and vitality. All of these come from this felt sense of deprivation. Deprivation becomes illness. When there is not enough resource inside or around us, we get sick. And so many more of us these days are starting to develop all kinds of strange illnesses or conditions that are generally non-diagnostic, or we also see a whole new slew of diagnoses, I guess, being made up to fit these strange symptoms. And many of them do go back to an underlying sense of survival and deprivation, whether it is in the body or the mind. But of course, it is systemic in nature. Let's talk about hustle. Sometimes when we are living through survival, we have to hustle to survive. We have to hustle to eat, to get a roof over our head, to be included, to get a seat at the table. And when we are living with this sort of hustle decontextualized inside us, we will often sense that it's not enough. It's never enough. We have this lack mentality and we find ourselves rushing forward to get more, have more, be more. And this sense of urgency that is kind of living permanently in the nervous system, it propels us to some invisible, unconscious idea of safety or abundance. But in fact, it's doing the opposite. So it's one of these paradoxical experiences where we're wanting this safety and this abundance and this just wonderful life, but we're actually leaking our energy and becoming more depleted, more unsafe, more under-resourced than ever before. Hustle causes burnout. Now, burnout has become a pretty big issue in recent years. It's partly due to our trauma adaptations. It's partly due to the way the modern world is shaped. And we'll be talking about that a little later. But if we really do want to look at our own burnout or collective burnout within a culture, whether that's a corporate culture or a cultural culture, we need to understand that it is very likely that part of the issue is this collective trauma that's rolling through us and between us and creating more and more burnout. Survival also causes competition. When there's not enough and when we need to reach for safety, we will compete. And again, when this is something that we carry as trauma inside us, we end up creating this dog eat dog world where we're full of judgment, we're full of comparison, and basically we've got an epidemic of enemies or frenemies. And we see this in many different layers of our world. If you think about social media, which we're all on social media all the time, which is actually kind of scary. But we're primed to compete and to compare and to judge, and to set ourselves apart from each other. And we don't just do it on social media, we do it when we're walking down the street looking at others. And sadly, we do it in our close circles with our peers, our loved ones, even. We are competing. And, we're competing and comparing ourselves, how we look, what we're wearing, how much money we're earning, where we're living, who we're partnered with. And this comes from a deep sense of survival. When we feel truly safe and truly connected, there is no competition, not at all. And wouldn't that be a nice place for us to be, where we're not comparing or competing with each other? Competition is the enemy of connection. Now, the word connection is really important. As I mentioned before, so often with our trauma, we feel really alone with it. And in fact, we are relational creatures. We cannot exist alone, even if we try to convince ourselves we're self sufficient. In order to feel healthy and well and alive, we need to be in dynamic. We need to be connected. So if you think about the way we come into this world, it's through connection. Connection with our mother, connection with our father, ideally into family. And we're just born this way. We need it in order to thrive and in order to evolve. When we are holding this sense of disconnection, we will perpetuate cultures of exclusion and disconnection. Trauma creates polarity, inequity, and the splitting off from each other. We hunker down, either alone or with people who feel familiar, and we turn everyone else into a threat. We hold suspicion inside us, and it can be as if we're primed, kind of just waiting for others to come to oppress or hurt or manipulate us in some way. We become primed to protect instead of connect. When we're waiting for perpetrators to come, we will eventually be eaten alive by them, or we will inadvertently become the perpetrators ourselves. So, this sense of exclusion and disconnection, I believe, is the seed of war. We create this us and them paradigm. And it's deeply protective, it's deeply reactive, it's the breeding ground for bias, projection, assumption, misunderstanding, and relational reactivity. And so when we're living with this felt sense of exclusion and disconnection and us and them, we tend to make up stories about each other and about ourselves too, and we get stuck in our stories. And something that I find really fascinating, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on this as well, is it's so interesting that storytelling has become such a phenomenon recently. I mean, especially through LinkedIn and the corporate world, we're using our stories to sell, to hustle, to compete. Our stories actually keep us trapped in the cycle of collective trauma. Because remember, that hustle and that competition is part of the trauma that's propelling us. And I just find this super, super fascinating. And while we're stuck in our stories and while we're hustling and while we're competing, we perpetuate this sense of loneliness. So there can be people all around us. We might go to work in the office and there's people everywhere. We may even have friends and close others in our lives, but perhaps we still feel alone. And this is part of living with this physiological, relational, dynamic, and largely existential experience of trauma. Loneliness in certain countries is being classed as an epidemic now. We're lonelier than ever, and it kind of doesn't make rational sense, does it? Because many of us have a lot of freedom. We can connect to each other if we wish. We can connect to each other online, and yet we don't. We're more and more alone, and I believe it is this trauma that's kind of moving through us. Another thing that happens when we are living with trauma is that we become disconnected from ourselves. I call this loss of self. So something that happens is that we dissociate and we disconnect from our healthy impulses and intuition. And we do that because it's really not safe to have our impulses and intuition. But when we are disconnected in this way and when we don't know who we are and what we want and what we stand for, it keeps us really vulnerable to either being eaten alive or excluded by the pack. And if we look around the world today, so many of us are disconnected and we are being vulnerable to be taken away from everything that serves us. And so more and more of us are losing ourselves and staying in this trauma cycle. As a humanity, we have become more disconnected and we have become more disempowered. We claim back our power by repairing the proprioceptive pathways inside us and between us. It's collective. We need to wake up our collective intuition, our impulses, and our ability to lean into intimacy and away from harm. Our healthy impulses and expression are the only thing that will take us away from what doesn't serve us and towards all that heals and nourishes us. All of our complex survival responses kind of feed into each other and become this complex manifestation of who we are and the cultures we weave today. Our unhealed collective trauma creates cycles of polarity, inequity, disease, conflict, and war. And on that quite serious note, before we start talking about how we heal, which is the exciting part, I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions that have come through. Marianne?
Yep, so we've got one from LinkedIn where Sonia is asking, why do we compete with ourselves and not always with others?
That's a really interesting question. To me, it comes back to in my book, I have a chapter on the inherited voice. And I think the inherited voice is this amalgamation of all of the external influences that shame us, that judge us, that tell us what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and that we need to keep climbing the mountain. So the inherited voice could have influences from parents, it could have influence from culture, it could have influences from capitalism. And it all becomes this very loud voice in our head that tells us we need to do better and that it's never good enough. And a huge part of healing, in my opinion, and it's still a daily practice for me, is to watch that, to notice that, to witness that self shaming, criticizing, push you, keep going voice, and to set a really big boundary with it and say, this is not how I'm going to treat myself. This is not how I want to exist in the world. And to me, it took a long time for me to externalize that voice, that very complex voice, but it's still something that I meet in my daily practice because there continue to be forces in the modern world that make it louder because we live in this very capitalist climb the mountain world. I hope that answers. Let me know if there's a follow-up question. Marianne, is there another question? We can do a few more.
Yeah, so there's another one from Justin. Enjoying this message. How do we survive in a world that is so toxic? Truly getting to a conscious state in a world where so many are living unconsciously.
It's really hard work, Justin. I think when we get to the point where our will is bigger than our fear, it becomes part of our daily practice and the way we live. But I don't think it's a finite process. In a moment, we're going to go into how do we heal, and I'm going to share a few different ways that we can look at it. One of the concepts I teach in my trauma-informed human training is around psychological sovereignty. And I think it's a good point of departure to begin to know, well, what is me and who I am? And what are these external influences that are asking me to be different or telling me that I am different than I am? And that in itself is a bit of a process to get there to know, well, this is me. And all of the things that are being projected upon me or put upon me are not me. And so that's a really great place to begin and to return to again and again. But we'll be going into a little bit more shortly how to live consciously in such a difficult world and a difficult time in humanity. Marianne, let's take two more questions if there are any, and then I'll move on to how do we heal.
So Sophia, she's in lieu of this, in such a traumatized world with all the hustle culture, I wonder how can we escape it without becoming hermits?
It's hard. So I think a theme coming through here is this is not easy. It's easier to be swept up amongst the chaos, isn't it? But there are many of us that realize that that's not what we want, and that's not the world we want to co-create and bring to our next generation either. When I hear the word hermit, I think about, I've spent quite a bit of time in Bali. Um, and Bali feels like to me this big sort of bubble where people go to escape a lot of the toxicities of the world. But it can feel like when you leave the modern world, it's almost as if you can't go back, you get trapped. So to be able to live in the modern world, there are conditions. You've got to work, you've got to earn money, you've got to put a roof over your head, and you've got to behave um, in certain ways in order to be here. And so I think it's about juggling, isn't it? How do I create that bubble for myself and build my resource and build my resilience and then walk back into this interconnected yet so disconnected world and move through it and learn to watch when I'm reaching my signs of overwhelm or dysregulation and come back into my sacred bubble, whatever that looks like for you. So for me, I've just moved to Sydney by the ocean, and this little home that I'm in is going to become my sacred bubble. But I don't want to only stay alone looking after myself. I want to be deeply connected to humanity. So, it's this little bit of dance, but staying so conscious and connected to know, well, what do I have the resource for? Um, how can I do this while living in my capacity? Or sometimes we need to make a conscious choice to push beyond our capacity. If I think back to a couple of years ago, getting ready for my book launch, I consciously went beyond my capacity because there was so much I wanted to do to bring this to the world. But it did have a knock on effect. I was tired. I wasn't feeling 100%. And then I was able to say, okay, well, now it's time for me to go back into my cocoon. So the more we access our agency and our choice and stay connected to our own signals and be able to follow them and action them, the more we'll be able to weave through the world and not either get lost in the noise or get trapped in the bubble. Because sometimes that bubble that initially feels really safe can turn into a bit of a prison if we don't make the effort to leave it and connect back in to the messy fabric of humanity. Thanks for a great question, Sophia. I'll take one more question right now, Marianne.
And that's all the questions we have for now.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. So feel free to keep the questions or reflections coming. And I'm going to move on to see if I can answer the question, or at least begin to. How do we heal? Healing asks us to challenge our tendencies to self deprivation and learn to look after ourselves. Healing asks us to notice our tendency to hustle and to slow down and live within our capacity. Healing asks us to look at our tendency to comparison and competition and catch ourselves. Stop jumping up on pedestals or racing up mountains and stand among each other. Healing also asks us to start reaching out to each other, to reach into the parts of ourselves that have been whispering their needs and truths quietly for the longest time and listen, respond, give them what they need. Healing asks us to come home to our bodies, to somatize, and to get in touch with our feelings, our impulses, our boundaries, and our intuition. For so many of us, this is wildly uncomfortable because we will meet an ocean of grief and perhaps the divine rage that is, in fact, our greatest power and evolutionary force. Healing asks us to stop using our stories to sell, compare, and set ourselves apart, and rather remember the wisdom of our ancestors who let story lead the healing process, let it weave the words of our belonging, set pain free, and set sacred intention together. The more conscious we become in the way we move in this world, the more beautiful world we will co-create. So those are my thoughts on healing. And I wonder if any of them speak to you, or if you have any more questions or reflections on those, please bring them through. And while I sort of wait to engage with you a little more, let's orient in the human timeline right now. We are probably the most traumatized we have ever been. Past trauma does play a role in this. So we are carrying our trauma forward and it's decontextualizing and spiraling into what we create. But this is also a structural thing. Trauma is dynamic, relational, and systemic. So the systems that our world is built upon actually keep us stuck in the cycles of trauma. Commerce and capitalism play a role. We are propelled to live in hustle, to live in competition, and to keep climbing and climbing and living beyond our capacity and competing with each other. The digital landscape plays a toll. The more we are orienting to the screen and connecting in the metaverse, the less we are orienting to ourselves and our bodies and our impulses, and the less we are out amongst each other, connecting in person, nervous system to nervous system, eye to eye. Nothing beats in-person interaction. Family and community structure also play a toll. In many countries now, the family unit exists as a standalone unit. And this doesn't make it very easy for particularly parents and particularly mothers to live within their capacity. So there's more and more sense of burnout and overwhelm, which causes discord and dissonance, which causes self-deprivation, which causes emotional reactivity, which causes misattunement amongst the family. It wasn't so long ago that we lived in communities where there were many families who shared resources and therefore increased the capacity for everybody to have everything they needed and live in a state where there was no sense of lack. So the modern structure of the world and the way we live doesn't really serve us. And I think that's something for many of us to think about. I know that when I was living here in Australia with two very, very young babies, with a traveling husband, I could not cope. It was sort of just me and two babies. I had two under two, which was pretty hard. And something really powerful about moving to Singapore was that I got support. And I think that sense of support and to be able to live in proximity with others where you can help each other out is really very important. Healing asks us to honor that the systems our world is built upon are hurting us and commit to the difficult task of reorganization. The thing is, when we reorganize the structures that our world is built upon, we will often enter a state of healing crisis because the structures are kind of holding us up, but they're also trapping us. And so when we take away the structure or the glue, there's going to be some kind of mayhem or chaos, some loss, and that's going to feel difficult in itself. And our task is to get really clear about what healing crisis is and enter it with consciousness and in ways that are slow rather than quick and very disruptive or disorganizing. Because when we kind of let ourselves know and let each other know, well, we're going to make some changes and there is going to be sort of distress or loss or chaos, but we're going to hold ourselves and each other through it. That's when we start this conscious reorganization of our world. Healing crisis happens when we set a giant boundary with the systems and dynamics and relationships that are perpetuating our discomfort, disease, and unhappiness. And it's never comfortable, but it's necessary for root cause transformation. I've set a couple of really big boundaries in my life that caused total chaos. For some of you that follow my work or may have read my book, you may know that I was sort of trapped in the medical system for nearly 20 years, really sick. You know, the illness was through every part of my body, every system. I was having 4 intravenous treatments a month. I was on 42 medications a day, and I was sort of just stuck. And there was a point where I had to say, no, this system is making me sicker. I'm done. And of course, when I decided to come off medication and come off treatments, which I am not suggesting for anybody tuning in, by the way, I'm just sharing a little piece of my story. My body went haywire. And there was about 4 months of all this crazy stuff, but I had to hold myself through it. And then I was well again, and my system, my body, reorganized itself. Another time that I've set a pretty big boundary and entered healing crisis was when I decided to leave my marriage of 20 years. And of course, my world was built upon the structure of the marriage. So when I decided to exit, it caused so much chaos, but it was necessary both times that I set these huge boundaries and entered chaos. There was drama, there was loss, there was this deep reorganization, and I could build again more consciously and more in touch with my own needs and impulses and intentions. So healing crisis happens when we set this giant boundary. What does this look like from a collective perspective? I've told you a little bit about from a personal perspective. Is it possible? Is it possible, I even wonder, or are we too far gone? What does it look like to set boundaries with the systems, dynamics, and relationships that are perpetuating our discomfort and disease? And some questions for your inquiry. I do not have the answers. Let's just get curious. That's where change begins. Is post-capitalism even possible? Is it possible to halt the metaverse from taking over the world? It's possible to return to living in communities and sharing resources. Some people already are doing this. And is it possible to not look at it as an either or scenario and rather become empowered to challenge the tidal wave of progress in small ways each and every day? The more safe we are inside ourselves, and the more of us that are on the same wavelength, the greater the possibilities for us all. There are more of us. Even today, there are more of you than ever before tuning into this session. When I was in Austin in September, I met with a bunch of really wonderful practitioners and people who are choosing this sort of conscious way of living and co-creating community. And we said to each other, wow, there are more of us. I'm not alone. And there are more of us who want it to be different. There are more of us who are choosing something different every single day. And it is important that we find and champion each other. This is the movement of collective healing. I'm going to pause again. I can see that a few sort of comments and questions have come in as I've been sharing. Marianne, do you want to send a couple at me?
There's a question from Justin. What has been the biggest changes you have made in your life that have impacted your healing journey that you incorporate into your daily healing practice?
I mean, there have been so many and it continues. I live quite a nonconformist life, and I have, since I was 24, I have not been employed. I was not well, and I realized that a 9 to 5 job did not work for me. And so that's had its own challengings and its own blessings. And as I said, sort of setting a boundary with the way I was viewed by the medical world was really important for me. Exiting a marriage that didn't work for me is really important for me. Something that's in my practice these days is, as I'm building my work in this space, it's so easy to get on the climb the mountain train. And I keep stopping myself. I'm like, nope, nope, Natalia, you're not going to keep going and more and more. You're going to slow down, and you're going to stay with what feels true, and you're going to stay connected with those who are here with you. And this is a very, very regular part of my practice. Thank you for the question. I'll take one more question, Marianne, right now, please.
No questions at the moment, just comments about like the resonance of what you are saying and agreeing that we really need systemic changes right now, as well as like loving the concept of reorganization that takes place after crisis. So just a lot of interaction. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really pleased that what I'm saying is resonating, and I hope it inspires more thoughts and more conversations in all the circles that you live within and co-create within. Let's talk a little about the concept of toxic soil and toxic culture. So I actually really dislike the word toxic. It makes me kind of angry. Um, we live in cultures where we tend to judge and shame and blame each other, again, sending ourselves further away and deeper into the trauma cycle. No human is truly toxic. Rather, they've either grown up without the things they need to thrive, or they've been plunged into circumstances that have forced them into survival mode. And we're really good at calling people toxic or calling cultures toxic. And this really makes it so much worse. Collective healing asks us to reassign the toxic label to the conditions and dynamics around us rather than each other. So we need to start saying no to labels and no to shame and blame and no to pathology. Collective healing asks us to see beyond manifestation and look at root cause. Collective healing asks us to access compassion and intelligence in how we are addressing the gross amount of distress, disrespect, abuse, illness, and confusion in our world. So, how do we access this intelligence? In some ways, it's really complicated, but in some ways, it's actually very simple. We are devoid, most of us, the three things that we need to feel like we are safe in this world. They are safety, belonging, and authenticity. The whole premise of my book, Why Am I Like This, is that many of us did not get these things or do not have these things now. And it is causing us to adapt in these survival ways and in these exclusion and disconnected ways. It becomes increasingly hard to find or create them. And often, even when we reach for one, we lose another one. So our fundamental human needs are not being met. And this is why we continue to adapt and survive rather than to heal and evolve. So if we connect to these three principles, safety, belonging, and authenticity, we can ask, how can I create these for myself every single day? How can I continue to reach for them and weave these into my world? We can also ask, how can I invite them for others? This is about attunement, intention, and reverence. The remedy is human, it's social, it's systemic. This philosophy is really simple, but the application is complex, it's non-linear, and it can't be rolled out in a mass quick fix plan, which we love. We love a mass quick fix plan. It's going to take time. It's going to take unearthing, unlearning, shedding, grieving, raging, reorganizing, testing, recalibrating, reminding, giving it space and time to settle and integrate and to become the normal, if there is even such a thing. That is the journey. It begins by looking at how we ourselves are continuing to perpetuate cycles of trauma and making the deepest commitment to shift it, to become accountable for the way we show up and co create this world. We are in dynamic. We have to do this together. As humans who want to heal, who want to lead, facilitate, and be part of the solution, there's a requirement to keep looking inward, doing our own deep healing work, unlocking our human intelligence to show up and contribute to collective healing rather than just move in the same old ways that are not really getting us anywhere good. And this is what my work is about, healing for social change for all of us. Now, in a minute, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what's happening this year, but I'll pause one more time, Marianne, just to see if there's been any questions.
There's a question from Miriam. How do you address toxic people or culture when avoiding the word toxic?
We can simply say this is not okay. So, a big piece of this is about boundary setting. And when we set boundaries, linking back to that idea of healing crisis, there's often going to be fallout, whether in our personal lives, whether at work. So it changes the way we're relating and the wheels that are turning. And so we need to be prepared that when we say no to what feels toxic or unsafe or harmful, there's going to be some kind of knock-on effect. And it's kind of a watch and wait situation to see, well, how do others respond to my boundaries? And very often those people that are called toxic are not able to respond to the boundaries. And then that brings another question of, well, what's next? And the very difficult thing for many of us, whether it's in our personal lives or whether it's at work, sometimes we're not ready to put in the hardest boundary, which is to walk away, because we feel that we need that connection or something from that person in our lives. So it's really complex and there's not any simple answer. Is there one more question, Marianne?
From Nikki, how do we maintain our self-regulation when around dysregulated, traumatized people who violate all of our boundaries and trigger our traumas?
The same response as before is it's really hard to do that, Nikki. So first, I want for us all to validate when somebody is aggressing us or harming us or taking from us in some way, we will be affected. None of us are these magical beings that are never going to be affected when somebody's not being very nice, or being harmful or neglectful. So we first want to validate our own experience. This hurts. This is stressing me out. This is affecting me. Because so often we want to go to that shame pathology place. Oh, there's something wrong with me. Why can't I be impervious to all the evil of the world? None of us are. We're human and we're dynamic. So the first is to validate it. Um, if we are not able to alter or exit the harmful dynamics, which is really true, I think it's a difficult truth for many that are living in difficult, harmful relationships or dynamics at work or at home. There's this constant grating on the nervous system and this constant triggering. And so, if we are not able to change the dynamic, if that person is not listening, and if we're not able to leave for whatever reason, and often there are some really big survival reasons at play, all we can do is keep making that bubble for ourselves to regulate, and keep coming back to center, keep building resilience. We can also seek people who offer us something different. And so orienting to and reaching out to safe people with regulated nervous systems who can respect our boundaries, it starts to shift the landscape of our world. So it might not get rid of the people, that are affecting us in harmful ways, but it gives us something different. And it shifts, I guess, the ecosystem that we are living within. And often it can be that the building and nourishing of these other really beautiful, respectful relationships and that continued ability to create that little bubble builds more power and builds resilience so that at some point we do have enough agency and resource to say, well, no more. I hope that answers, and I welcome a follow-up question, Nikki, if there is one. Is there one more question, Marianne?
Not at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So this is such big work for all of us, isn't it? It's not an easy task, and it's also very complex and nuanced, and it is a life's work. A lot of my work is about helping us feel empowered to continue to build that peace and that power inside ourselves and to become a source of peace and power for those that we are leading or facilitating or serving or loving. And so that work continues and it continues to sort of shift and change. I'm really excited next week to be flying back to Singapore, to continue to teach human intelligence leadership program, back at Balanced Living, this beautiful venue where we've been teaching the last couple of years. It's really wonderful to see so many ongoing students joining for Module 3, which is all about reintegrating the fragmented self, and really cultivating a complex compassion and power in the way we understand and relate and lead others. And we also have modules 1 and 2 repeating with new students. Module 1 is trauma-informed human, where we really understand what it means to live and breathe and embody a trauma-informed approach to leadership and facilitation. And module 2 is nervous system mastery, where we make friends with, we commune with our own nervous system, and we learn to tune into and understand others and how that we are influencing or being influenced every time. So it's a really sort of very powerful somatic module. I've also in the middle right now of teaching trauma-informed human online. So this program that I've been teaching in person for a couple of years now, I'm working with the first global group online. It's been adapted into a 3-month journey where we meet 6 times, 6 live sessions, and you also get 6 self-led learning modules. And it's been really wonderful connecting with this group. This group is all women, and it's been very, very sacred. The next online cohort is going to start in June. So we've just opened registration for that. And if this work is something that inspires you or calls you, I'd love to see you join us. It's really a very, very beautiful, profound process. So Marianne is sharing the link in the chat. And because you have made the time and intention to join me here today, I'm going to offer you 15% off if you would like to register before the 1st of March. Also, for the first time, we have our new Director of Learning Engagement, Catherine, who is going to be opening her doors for special consult calls if you would like to learn a little bit more about this program before opting in. So after the session, you will get an email with the option to book a call with her. And I highly encourage you to have a chat. She's really wonderful, and I'm pleased to have her on board. If joining one of the programs is something you want, but there are financial constraints, we do always offer partial sponsorships. We really want to make this accessible, and we also offer special rates for those of you in developing countries. So if you're not sure, please reach out. We really, really want to collaborate with you. So yeah, I'm looking forward to June. I'm also really feeling inspired to continue writing and creating this year. So I'm focusing a lot on my new article series, Sex and Psychology, which is all about doing the healing work we need to do to become available for healthy relationships. So that's taking some of my energy. I've also been writing poetry prolifically here in Sydney, and I can feel that wants to come as well. So I'm thinking of maybe going to Europe for 6 or 8 weeks over the Australian winter and the European summer to really drop into that and see what needs to form. I will also be back, I forgot, in April to teach in the USA. I'm going to be back to New York continuing my work in behavioral healthcare leadership. While I won't be offering any open programs in the US this time, I may look to put on a small open event where I can meet some of you in person and we can have some of these discussions face to face. So that's it from me today. I'll pause, Marianne. Are there any last questions before we say goodbye from today's session?
Yes, there was another question from Miriam. What are some ways to lovingly leave unhealthy relationships?
I don't know if that's something that I can advise on specifically. Before we leave an unhealthy relationship, we need to make sure there's not going to be any harmful ramifications for us. And to leave lovingly will really depend on what's going on with the other person. So it's so complex. But if it's really simple, we may just be able to say, I've really enjoyed our time together, but I think I need a fresh chapter and I wish you all the best. And so to find that peaceful, honest voice. The thing is, when there's a lot of charge and tension and history in relationship, even the most peaceful and loving, honest voice may cause a trigger. So then it's about how we deal with that. I hope that answers. Is there one more question, Marianne?
Yep, Heather is asking, is Module 2 available online?
Module 2 is not yet available online. I waited a really long time before putting Module 1 online because, to be honest, the in-person experiences are so deeply profound. It's 3 days, but it feels like a lifetime in 3 days, and any of my students will tell you that. So I took a long time to really make sure I could develop something that felt super congruent and just as transformational within this 3-month period. So I will do the same for Module 2, but I'm not yet ready. We might think about doing something like that in 2025. and we will keep you posted. So for now, it's just module one. Something else that I am considering, because as I said, I'm feeling just like in the middle of my own big personal shift, is that I may like to make something more retreat style. But in line with my not wanting to climb and rush and hustle, I'm really sort of just staying with what is and what we have and really nurturing it and allow it to grow organically and sustainably. Thanks for asking, though. Glad to know that you're interested in module two. It's a pretty beautiful module. I will do module four live in Singapore in September for the first time. And module four is all about once we've done the deep healing work to become trauma informed, to soothe our nervous system, to become more internally and externally cohesive and congruent, how do we restructure our world? How do we co-create something totally different? So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for the recommendation, Heather and Sophia. I really, really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to seeing you both online next week. And you should have your online learning content for the next module coming to you today, I think. All right. Are there any more questions, Marianne, or are we pretty much wrapping up now?
Yeah, that's pretty much it now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I really appreciate your time, your energy, your participation. And yeah, I hope that there are more thoughts that come through the day, through the weeks beyond this. Remember, you will get the recording after this if you would like to watch again. And I encourage you, if you are considering joining us in June, to take advantage of the special 15% offer or consider getting on a call with Catherine. If you tuned in from LinkedIn, you won't receive an email after this. But if you would like to have the option of the recording and the consult call with Catherine, just drop your email address in the comments or in the DM, and we'll make sure that you have access to that opportunity too. Thank you, everybody, so much. And I will see you for the next live in around about 3 months. And the next live, we'll be exploring how unhealed trauma affects our romantic relationships. So, a little bit of a different tangent or vibe for the next one. Have a beautiful day. I'm off into the sunshine. Bye.